I think for months now, we've been hearing that Russia was on the brink of defeat, right? The sanctions are draining their war chest dry and Putin is on the verge of surrendering. Well, in a sudden twist of events, it appears that Russia isn't collapsing and is in fact gaining ground in Ukraine. Now, the Russian forces are apparently experiencing victory in Soledar, and I don't think I've seen such amazing spin from the mainstream media about how it is actually a defeat. Now, we have Russia claiming victory over Soledar, a salt mining town in Ukraine. Now, the town is just next to Bakhmut, the frontline city, and by capturing Soledar, Russia is actually within closer striking distance of the city. Now, it definitely improves their positioning, but it's probably just one piece of the greater battle for Bakhmut. But what I want us to focus on is the narratives that are being told around Soledar because it's really interesting seeing the spin doctors out in full force, right? We are in a narrative war between both Russia and the collective West. Now, putting up a story from Reuters, we have the Ukrainians claiming that Soledar is still under their control, with the Donetsk governor saying Soledar remains under the control of our military and the enemy, which is the Russians, is incurring huge losses. We also have stories about how the fall of Soledar for Russia is actually a Pyrrhic victory, that the Russians might actually be winning, but the casualties suffered are going to cripple their efforts in the long term. And here's an interesting one from the New York Times. Apparently, Russia's claim to seize a Ukrainian town exposes rifts among forces, which is referencing how the credit might be stolen from the Wagner group by the Russian military. And here's the thing, all those might be true, but it is obscuring what's actually happening in the front. The Ukraine conflict is about to hit the 1 year mark, guys, and all the events we are seeing tells us that both sides they are entrenched deeply in the conflict, right? And there's going to be more fighting on all fronts. Now, if we listen to Russia, they are claiming that Ukraine has lost and the salt mining town of Soledar has been captured. And according to the BBC themselves, Soledar does matter. It provides the Russians with a secure artillery position within range of Bakhmut, which could put further pressure on the defenders in the city. And we can see just how close the town is to the city of Bakhmut, which is just 6 miles away. Now, what's more interesting is how Soledar, being a salt mining town, of course, has deep salt mines where the Russians could station troops and store equipment, right? They could turn it into a staging base of sorts to entrench themselves further in this conflict. But I think the victory or ongoing battle, whichever side you believe, is truly a struggle for morale. It is a symbolic victory that both Russia and NATO needs. Because if we zoom out and we look beyond just the fighting on the ground, guys, there's a big geopolitical and financial war happening between Russia and the G7. And we need to recall what happened last month in the United States, and I'm of course talking about the 1.7 trillion omnibus bill, of which 45 billion went to Ukraine. Now that is a lot of money, guys. And if you're in Congress, you need to justify that spending is effective, that it is working to keep the Russians at bay. So if Soledar falls to the Russians, that is a big stain on the spending bill. Is the West throwing good money after bad? That's a big question. And it isn't just the omnibus bills that policymakers have to account for. The inflation disaster in 2022 was in part caused by all the Western sanctions slapped on Russia. It's not just the money printing for the Federal Reserve. And there's the sanctions on Russian assets that led to a treasury dump by China. There's the sanctions on Russian oil and gas that led to higher energy prices, especially for Europe. Now, all this needs to be accounted for. People in the West, they need to know if the price they are paying in the form of inflation is worth it. And if Russia manages to take Soledar or Bakhmut, this is a PR disaster for the West. And that's why we are seeing so much spin and angling in the news. Now, the Russians also need this symbolic victory. It shows to the countries supporting them, especially BRICS and OPEC, that they aren't collapsing just yet. So the ground battle is just as important as the financial front because they are all interconnected. Now, what if Russia claims it's true and the ground situation is indeed a Russian victory? Then the West is probably going to double down on their efforts. And I don't just think they're going to put boots on the ground just yet. I don't think they're going to do that because it could trigger the unthinkable, right? But more money and weapons are going to flow into Ukraine. And here's the thing about all this extra funding. When you pour money into the conflict, it's going to go into commodities and into the defense industry. You need oil and gas to fight battles. You need base metals to build the war machine. And this means more inflation is coming, guys, even if we don't see it today. We have Europe now on the brink of sending Western tanks to Ukraine, and this is serious stuff. France, Poland, and the UK, they have all pledged to send in battle tanks to Zelensky. And Germany is also about to deliver their Leopard tanks as well. Now, this is an escalation, and by all measures, we are in a proxy war. The EU is sending in their tanks, America is sending in their money, while Russia is basically sending in everything, right? And that's why Soledar is significant, not because of its strategic importance, but because of the timing of this conflict. It could very well just be a sleepy town on the way to Bakhmut, but Soledar could represent a turning point for the Russians, which NATO will want to stop. Now, I think we are on a collision course for disaster sooner or later because both Russia and Ukraine they have hardline positions for negotiations and they are not going to budge. Putin obviously wants to consolidate his gains, annex new regions in the east, and retain control of Crimea. But Zelensky, he has a 10-point peace plan for any negotiations, right? Specifically, Ukraine, they want Russia out of the country and compensation amongst many other things. Now, we know that none of that is going to happen. So the fighting is going to continue and both sides are going to grind each other down in the field. And every time Russia gains a semblance of victory, we are going to see the West just pour in more money and supplies into the battlefront. But let's go beyond just the battle on the ground because we are on a multi-front war where the real battle is financial. And by now, we should be able to see the agenda of both Russia and the West when it comes to this financial fight. Now, the West is trying to starve Russia out. They are desperately trying to deplete the Russian war chest, and that's why they froze $300 billion of Russian assets and why the G7 came out of the price cap back in December last year. Now, Russia's agenda is a little different. Their agenda is to make the war incredibly expensive to fund for America and Europe, right? Putin wants to bankrupt the West by making them go further into debt and ramp up deficit spending, especially in the period where interest rates are going up. And this brings us to another big escalation that's going to come for Russia. And I'm talking about the G7 oil price cap 2.0. Now, this is a tricky one because now the G7 coalition is planning to cap not just Russian crude, but their oil products like gasoline and diesel. What they want to do is to prevent Russia from refining their own crude oil and bypassing the sanctions, right? Russia has the third largest refining capacity in the world, so they could technically refine their own crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and kerosene and sell them off at market prices. Now, the West wants to cut that off and squeeze Russian revenues even more. But if that happens, we'll see more supply issues in the oil markets, especially in the West. For example, in Europe, around a third of their diesel supply comes from Russia, and when the ban starts on February the 5th, the EU is going to have to replace those supplies. And that means they'll have to get more expensive diesels from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and even China. Let's talk about China for a little bit. China has been getting cheap Russian crude for many months now, and their exports of diesel have been growing because the refining margins are just so high, right? They have almost 10x their diesel exports in just 12 months. The refining business is booming in China. So as we can see, the price caps might be hurting Russian revenues, but it's also hurting the West, especially the EU, which isn't a huge oil producer. And I think this shows us how determined the West is in hurting Russian revenues, that they are willing to suffer higher prices themselves. But we need to be careful of narratives in this conflict, right? Many people are telling multiple stories and it's all about hyping up their own agenda. There's the NATO side, there's the Russian side, and there's the truth. And it usually lies somewhere in the middle. We have a Biden advisor claiming that the oil price cap is working and Russia is suffering from lower revenues. The fact that the discount on Russian oil has widened is a good thing. We hope that it continues and we'll see where it takes us. And taking a look at the price of the euros, it is at $56, which is indeed lower than a $60 price cap. But the euros have almost always traded lower than the price of Brent crude, so Russia might be indeed taking a hit. But is it really sufficient to end the war? I really don't think so. And if we dig deeper, we can see the break-even cost of Russian oil production is around $40 a barrel. And that means the price cap isn't doing enough damage to hurt Putin's revenues, and the war isn't going to end anytime soon. And if the numbers are true, Russia can still continue making a profit on their oil sales without really cutting production yet. And from a report by Bloomberg, Russia's rallying their oil tanker fleet to beat the Western sanctions. And if you didn't know by now, the West essentially banned tankers from transporting Russian crude that is priced above $60 the price cap. So Western vessels, they aren't ferrying around the majority of Russian oil because Putin isn't playing along with the price cap. But if we look at the share of Russian crude exports, we can see whatever slack the European vessels have left, Russian ships are picking it up. The share of Russian vessels has actually risen from 22% to 35%. And this means they are mobilizing their shadow fleet and picking up where the sanctions left off. So Russian crude is still flowing to the markets because of the profits. The ground war back in Ukraine isn't going to stop anytime soon as well. And we have to prepare for a world that is going to get messier, guys. And I mean a world of supply shocks and energy inflation that could probably get worse. There are always two sides to the story, and we need to cut through the noise with our own independent thinking. I think Solidar has exposed the greater narrative war that we are in. The West, like Russia, has to fight tooth and nail for every territory because symbolic victories is everything in this conflict. And the battle for Bakhmut is going to be the big one because if Russia actually takes it, we are likely going to see even more money poured into Ukraine. Now, the West is going to fire another salvo of sanctions on Russia. It's going to come, and we even haven't discussed about the big one, which is the EU moving to confiscate Russian assets. Now, Germany is on board with the idea to seize Russian assets for Ukraine as repatriations, but that is a really slippery slope. Because if that line is crossed, we're going to see financial chaos being unleashed. Frozen Russian money will now flow directly into the economy, causing even more inflation, and the global treasury dump, especially from China, is going to continue. We're going to see more money flow into gold like never before because inflation is going to get worse and counterparty risk will be the biggest worry around for central banks. And how will this conflict end? I honestly think that for either side, it's going to be a complete victory on their terms or none at all. And I don't think there can be a compromise anytime soon. So let me know what you think in the comments below, guys. How important was the battle for Solidar? Will the West escalate their sanctions even further? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.